The Ransom of Mercy Carter, Chapter 3. The New England Wilderness, March 1st, 1704, temperature 10 degrees. Somebody was tapping Mercy in the ribs. It couldn't be Tommy, who pounced, or Sam, who jabbed. It wasn't John, who kissed, or Benny, who snuggled. Whichever brother it was had wet the bed in the night, and wet Mercy with him, and so far was still warm. But the moment she separated from that sleeping brother, it would be cold and awful. But the tapping would not stop, and Mercy woke to see a deerskin legging with a painted running deer. "Up," said her Indian. The paint had partly peeled off his face, giving him a patchy, smeared look. She remembered the day before backwards, the marching, the carrying, the slipping, the snow. She thrust memory away, folding it close. She would not think about the attack. "Lord, please," she prayed, "let me see Sam and John and Tommy and Benny. Let Uncle Nathaniel and Aunt Mary and the cousins be here. Let it not be true about Mara. Let stepmama and the baby be safe and sound and walking fast enough." Please stop here and answer question 1. The Indian stooped to take her hand and pull her to her feet, giving a slight grunt as he did. For the first time she saw that he too had been hurt, and that the paint on his side was his own dried blood. And Mercy knew then that she had experienced war, and that it was true about Mara. She did not take his hand, knowing what it had done. Rolling Daniel ahead of her, she was out of the snow hole and on her feet in a moment. There was some sort of assembly going on. The prisoners were stumbling toward Mr. Williams, who stood alone, his hand raised to the sky. "How extraordinary," thought Mercy. "They're going to let us pray." She was glad, because a day without morning prayer was unthinkable, but it didn't seem like something the Indians would permit. French Indians were Catholic, though, converted by priests from France itself. Mr. Williams often said that if you were Catholic you hated God and were evil and stole little children from their beds. The warriors had gathered in clumps. Yesterday had been complete victory for the Indians, and yet there was no rejoicing among them. Her captor's eyes were on a bundle in the snow. She had seen enough death in her life to know it. One of the Indian wounded had not survived the night. The posture of her Indian was human. It was grief. "Mercy, I'm hungry," said Daniel, and she said, "Hush, we'll eat later." Mercy was hungry too. The hunger wasn't yet pain, because Mr. Williams often called for a fast, and Mercy was used to going 24 hours without food. No matter what woe was visited upon Deerfield, shaking fever, crop failure, the snatching of Zeb and John, fasting made Mercy feel safe again. If 300 people ate nothing for a day and a night, surely the Lord would be impressed and might relent, and people would get well and corn would grow. She and Daniel took a moment to squat behind trees. They cleaned themselves with snow, and when she washed his face with a handful of icy white powder, Daniel giggled. He wanted to wash Mercy's face too, and she let him. By the time they reached the rest of the prisoners, Mr. Williams had begun speaking. He had a great deep voice that sounded just right when he read the prophets in the Bible. He could be Elijah, he could be Jeremiah. Mercy loved his voice. It was shaking now, but not with the ecstasy of belief that possessed Mr. Williams during the sermon. It was shaking with fear. If the Lord is not with Mr. Williams, thought Mercy, the Lord is not with any of us. She threw away a lifetime of training, and instead of listening harder to Mr. Williams, she stopped listening at all. Her prayer went so deep it had no form. It was just Lord, Lord, Lord. Please stop here and answer question 2. And the Lord was good, for among the crowd she saw Sam, John, and Benny, her Uncle Nathaniel, her Aunt Mary, and far away from the rest and separated from each other, her cousins Will and little Mary. She could not see stepmama, the baby, or Tommy, but no doubt they, like Mercy, had been separated. As soon as prayers were over, she would find them. At some point during the night or early this morning, the French had joined them. There were far more soldiers than she had realized. 100 French, at least 200 Indians. With another 100 or so English prisoners, Mercy was among more people than she had ever seen gathered in one place. They were standing in distinct groups, divided by expanses of gleaming snow. The still bright French, the heavily armed Indians, the shivering English. "The frown of the Lord," said Mr. Williams, "is very great. This dread suffering is because we failed him." I failed him, thought Mercy. I did not save Mara. Mr. Williams prayed for the souls of the dead, listing name after name. Among those whose souls he entrusted to the Lord were her brother Tommy, her stepmother, and the baby. No, thought Mercy, I let them all die, even Tommy? Sleep tight, she had said to him, and now he would. If she had not wasted time giving her cloak to Ruth, if she had not taken Eliza's hand when Eliza went blind with shock, if she had shoved Jemima out of her way, could she have saved Tommy? Please stop here and answer question 3. The Indian next to Mr. Williams interrupted him roughly. We kill, you tell. Mr. Williams ceased to pray. Joe Alexander escaped last night, he said. If anyone else tries to escape, they will burn the rest of us alive. Burn alive? Burn innocent women and children because one young man flew from their grasp? Her Indian stood some distance away amid the other warriors. He was now wearing a vivid blue cloth coat of European design. In one hand he held his French flintlock, and over his shoulder hung his bow and a full otter-skin quiver. Actually, the entire dead otter, complete with face and feet. His coat hung open to show a belt around his waist, from which hung his tomahawk and scalping knife. His skin was not red after all, but the color of autumn, burnished chestnut. His shaved head gleamed. He looked completely and utterly savage. He might sorrow for a dead brother warrior, but grief would make him more likely to burn a captive, not less likely. Mercy imagined kindling around her feet, a stake at her back, her flesh charring like a side of beef. Beside her, Evan seemed almost to faint. Mercy had the odd thought that she, an 11-year-old girl, might be stronger than he, a 17-year-old boy. The English were silent, entirely able to believe they might be burned. The first person to move was Mercy's Indian. Sharply raising one hand, bringing all eyes upon him, he pointed to Mercy Carter. She was frozen with horror. His finger beckoned. There could be no mistake. The meaning was come. There was no speech and no movement from 100 captives and 300 enemies. It was the French Mercy hated at that moment. How could they stand by and let other whites be burned alive? She had no choice but to go to him. She set Daniel down. Perhaps they would spare Daniel. Perhaps only she was to be burned. She forced herself to keep her chin up, her eyes steady and her steps even. How could she be afraid of going where her 5-year-old brother had gone first? Oh, Tommy, she thought, rest in the Lord. Perhaps you are with mother now. Perhaps I will see you in a moment. She did not want to die. Her footsteps crunched on the stone. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The Indian handed Mercy a slab of cornmeal bread, and then beckoned to Daniel, who cried, "Oh, good, I'm so hungry," and came running, his little face happy, tilted in a smile as the Indian who fed him. "Mercy said we'd eat later," Daniel confided in the Indian. The English trembled in the relief, and the French laughed. The Indian knelt beside Daniel, tossing aside Tommy's jacket and dressing Daniel in warm, clean clothing from another child. Nobody in Deerfield owned many clothes, and if she permitted herself to think about it, Mercy would know whose trousers and shirt these were. But she did not want to think about what dead child did not need clothes. So she said to the Indian, "Who are you? What's your name?" He understood. Putting the palm of his hand against his chest, he said, "Tana Horns." She could just barely separate the syllables. It sounded more like a duck quacking than a real word. "Tana Horns," he said again, and she repeated it after him. She wondered what it meant. Indian names had to make a picture. Please stop here and answer question 4. She smiled carefully at the man she had thought was going to burn her alive as an example, and said, "I'll be right back, Tana Horns." She took a few steps away, and when he did nothing, she ran to her family. Her uncle swept her into his arms. How wonderful his scratchy beard felt, how strong and comforting his hug. "My brave girl," he whispered, kissing her hair. "Mercy, they won't let me help you." In a voice as childish and puzzled as Daniel's, he added, "They won't let me help your Aunt Mary or Will or little Mary either. I tried to help your brothers and got whipped for it." He stammered. Uncle Nathaniel, whose reading choices from the Bibles were always about war, whose voice made every battle exciting. He needed her comfort as much as she needed his. "Uncle Nathaniel," she said, "if I had done better, Tommy and Mara—" "Hush," said her uncle. "The Lord set a task before you, and you obeyed. Daniel is your task. Say your prayers as you march." In a tight little pack behind Uncle Nathaniel stood her 3 living brothers. How small and cold they looked! Sam lifted his chin to encourage his sister and said, "At least we're together. Do the best you can, Mercy. So will we." They stared at each other, the 2 closest in age, and Mercy thought how proud their mother would be of Sam. "Mercy!" cried her brother John, panicking. "You have to go! Go fast!" he said urgently. "Your Indian is pointing at you." Horns was watching her, but not signaling. "He isn't angry," thought Mercy. "I don't have to be afraid, but I do have to return." "Find out your Indian's name," she said to her brother. "It helps. Call him by his name." She took time to hug and kiss each brother. Please stop here and answer question 5. How narrow their little shoulders, how thin the cloth that must keep them from freezing. She had to go before she wept. Indians did not care for crying. "Be strong, Uncle Nathaniel," she said, touching the strange collar around his neck. "Don't tug it," he said wryly. "It's lined with porcupine quill tips. If I don't move at the right speed, the Indians give my leash a twitch and the needles jab my throat." The boys laughed, pantomiming a hard jerk on the cord, and Mercy said, "You're all just as mean as you ever were." "And alive," said Sam. When they hugged once more, she felt a tremor in him, deep and horrified, but under control. Again she was toward the end of the line. The pace was hard. They were heading northeast, with the goal, she assumed, of reaching the Connecticut River. It would be frozen solid, an actual road through the wilderness, but first they had to get there. It was one thing to follow a well-worn cow path over a hill stripped of its trees. It was another thing entirely to cut through the forest. Beneath the snow, like snares for rabbits or pits for deers, were the crevices and jags of the earth. Cliffs tumbled to the side. Fallen trees from ancient storms were like jumbled masts of ship thrown in the path. Tangled vine and briar grabbed legs and snapped against faces. The men who had refused to exchange their boots for Indian moccasins had to stop and wring the blood out of their stockings. As the day wore on, and Daniel fell, and Mercy fell, and Ruth fell, and Jemima fell, and Eben fell, as each time they were slower to get up and saw yet another mountain ahead, and understood that they were not going around, they were going over. Well, Mercy did not know how long they can continue. She was often overtaken by Indians coming up from the rear. Except for Horns, Mercy could not yet tell one from the other. Were these the same 2 or 3 circling and checking? Or Indians just now coming from the battle site? Or, more likely, returning from hunting this escaped prisoner? Mercy found herself checking scalps. Joe Alexander's hair was curly and brown, pulled into a tail, which itself curled and flopped. She found herself thinking, "No, that one's too blonde. That one's too short." By nightfall, horrifying as this pastime might be, she knew that nobody had caught Joe. He had gotten home. Such as it was. Mercy put one foot ahead of the other and refused to think of Deerfield. Sarah Hoyt had been given some moose jerky by her Indian, and she passed chunks to the other children, who chewed as they walked. It was as hard and dry as the shingle on a roof. Sarah's Indian had divided his loot, carrying his share tied in English blankets by putting Sarah's share inside an Indian leather sack. The forehead strap that attached Sarah's burden was embroidered with glittering glass beads. Every time Mercy looked at Sarah's headband, she wondered whose fingers had made that, whose needle, whose design. She always thought of Indians as being men, warriors, but the strap was proof that there were also women who loved beauty, who spent time in embroidery as once Mercy's mother had spent time on ruffles. Please stop here and answer question number 6. "Does it hurt to carry things by your forehead?" she asked Sarah. "No, it's heavy, but it rides well, at least so far. By dinner time it'll probably bother me." Sarah was laughing. "If we have dinner. If we don't, I'll really be bothered." Hairpins and bonnets had not been in Sarah's mind when she was yanked from her bed, so her beautiful auburn hair was not fastened up and hidden, but streaming in the wind. Mercy marveled that nobody had scalped Sarah. Didn't the savages see that coppery red hair and want it? Perhaps they did not scalp because of hair color. How did they make their decisions? How did they decide who deserved life and who did not? "How can you laugh about anything, Sarah?" said Jemima. She wiped tears away and sniffled heavily. "I hate this. I hate everybody. I'm not doing it." "Then you'll be dead," said Mercy. She could not be patient with Jemima. They all carried burdens, in their hearts or in their arms. "Jemima," said Sarah more gently, "did you not listen to Mr. Williams? We have to survive for each other and for the Lord. It is our duty." Jemima kept crying. Mercy and Daniel and Sarah with her pack put their minds on their feet and walked faster. Behind them straggled Ruth, wheezing and carrying nothing, Eben carrying everything, Eliza barely carrying herself, half-blind Joanna, whose pack had been taken back by her Indian after Ruth threw it, and who now carried only a fur rug draped over her shoulders, which made her probably the warmest prisoner on the march. Jemima carried her pack in her arms, sobbing into it. Joseph Kellogg, Joanna's brother, had 3 toddlers literally in tow, each child holding to a rope he'd wound around his wrist. It had been his plan that they should stumble less if they kept grip on the rope, but to such little children it was a game. They skidded along, letting Joseph pull. "Go, horsey!" cried Waitstill Warner. She was a pretty little girl, cold but not aware of it, hungry but forgetful of that too. Daniel wanted to get down so he could be hauled on the rope like his cousin Waitstill. "They're having fun," Jemima accused. "It's wrong of Joseph to be making sport. Their mothers are dead." "Jemima, Joseph is keeping them from crying," said Mercy. "They don't know how awful this is. They're having an adventure." But Jemima would not be comforted. "Here," said Mercy, "have some jerky. You'll feel better." She didn't really want to give it to Jemima. Jemima was perfectly sturdy. Anybody could fast for a day or 2. "I will not feel better," wept Jemima. "I want to go home. I want my mother." There were plenty of mothers on the march, but not Jemima's. Jemima was one of the stranded children. No father or mother, no brother or sister. Whatever had happened to their families, nobody had seen it, or nobody wanted to talk about it. "I will be your mother," said Mercy, who was exactly the same age as Jemima. She had, however, been mother to her brothers for 3 years. "Now hush, Jem. We must not fall behind." Please stop here and answer question 7. And then a creek, so fast flowing that even in this wicked cold it had not frozen. The Indians stood in ice water up to their thighs, handing the small children across, but the adults had to wade. Wet clothing froze to the body. In this wind, at this temperature, that could spell death. Should you fall in and get entirely wet, could you even get back on your feet in the force of that current? Would not your heart stop and your lungs fill? The adults dithered fearfully along the ice-rimmed rocks. "Lord," thought Mercy, wishing for solid English shoes instead of Indian slippers, "I have to get myself over. I can't let Daniel fall in. Ruth needs help. She hasn't thrown anything today because she's so tired she can hardly put one foot in front of another. Joanna can't see, and Eliza is still only half there." When her turn came, however, the Indians lifted Daniel from her arms and passed him safely to the other side. Mercy took a deep breath, steeling herself to enter the frigid water, but Tana-Horns lifted her, as if she weighed nothing, and set her ashore dry and safe. "Thank you, Tana-Horns," she said. They handed Ruth over as well, but Ruth did not thank them. "How could you?" she said to Mercy as the march went on. "How could you thank that man for anything? He killed your family." As the day wore on, Mercy ceased to worry about Eliza, who seemed able to walk steadily even if she had lost speech and hearing. She ceased to worry about Jemima, who was just going to cry forever. Instead, she began to worry about Eben. It was not the pack on his back that was hurting Eben. Sarah Hoyt, who was Eben's age, tried to comfort him. "Eben, do not despair." She talked softly to avoid Ruth's notice. Ruth was not a comforting person. Eben shrugged. "We will get there," said Sarah. "Wherever it is, whatever it is, we will stay together, and we will get there in the Lord." "No," said Eben. "I have sinned." They had all sinned, and they were all paying for it. A mile later, Sarah said, "Tell me the sin." "Pride. I was so proud of myself for saving my little sisters. Evan's little sisters were beautiful. Mercy adored them. Molly and Mary and Hitty hadn't left their house in months. Englishmen were not hunters. If they accidentally found deer or turkey, of course they shot it for dinner, or tried, but they were farmers, not sharpshooters. Indians, however, could hit anything, far away or up close. Mistress Nims was not about to let them pick off her daughters. Mercy's restrictions had never been that harsh. Inside the stockade, at least she had been able to go from house to house, from barn to woodpile, and to meeting on Sunday. Patiently, obediently, the little Nims girls stayed in week after week. Too little to weave, because they couldn't manage to loom, they could knit and they could sew. They were the only little girls in Deerfield ever to stitch samplers. Nobody else had the time to do it, or his mother to insist. "What happened, Evan?" said Sarah. "When I woke up, the attack began. My mother was downstairs screaming that the Indians were at the window. I put the girls in the cellar to keep them safe," he said to Sarah and Mercy. "But the Indians fired our house. My sisters burned alive." "Oh, Eben," whispered Sarah. She took his hand and they walked on together. "You did not set the fire. Do not hold yourself guilty." Poor Eben, thought Mercy. No wonder he believed the Indians when they threatened burning us alive. It happened to his sisters. Please stop here and answer question 8. Mercy prayed that smoke had taken Molly and Mary and Hitty, that they never felt fire. The story affected her feet. She could not seem to walk as fast nor find the energy to care. "I want to go home," said Jemima. "How many days of this? I can't do it." Mercy drew a deep breath. "Jemima, stop crying. They will hate it when you cry. And we don't know how long it will take, but Sarah's right. We can do it." Jemima stood staring blankly at the horizon, endlessly replaced itself with more hills and more wilderness. She had been crying for hours now, and had given up wiping her nose. Her hair had gathered in filthy hanks, and she stumbled blindly like Joanna. They came to a snowy hillside, as steep as a tilted plate, down which 100 people had already slid or fallen. Older children slid down on their stomachs or backs. Evan wiggled out of his pack and gave it a shove downhill. It made a channel in the snow. Joseph's 3 toddlers let go of the rope and whooshed down, giggling. "I'm a sled! I'm a sled!" shouted Daniel, tumbling down the hill and bumping into Sarah Hoyt's ankles. Sarah fell over, and a dozen children piled on top of each other, laughing, and had to be sorted out and turned upright by Indians. "Come, Eliza," said Evan, reaching for her hand, but she neither heard nor saw, so he put his arm around her waist, and the 2 of them skidded down together. At the bottom several boys started a snowball fight. Evan made snowballs for each side, handing them out as fast as they could be thrown. "I can't go on," said Jemima dully. She let go of her pack. Mercy forced herself to take Jemima's hand and pull her on. "You have to try, Jemmy. They will tomahawk you if you don't." "I don't care." "Of course you care." Mercy picked up Jemima's pack. She could carry it in her arms. It wasn't that heavy. She'd still be able to lift Daniel when she got down to him. "I'll carry this for you, Jemmy. You carry yourself." But Jemima did not move. Mercy linked her arm through Jemima's to haul her forward, but Jemima would not, or could not go. They were the very last English at the top of the hill. It was suddenly terrifying and eerie. Children playing at the bottom as if this were recess from school, parents far off on their leashes, and Mercy and Jemima left behind. Jemima's Indian appeared at their side. He had been one of the braves carrying a wounded warrior, but his warrior had died that morning. All day he had walked apart, paying no heed to Jemima that Mercy had seen. He continued to carry the body. Mercy did not know if he planned to take it home to Canada to bury, or if he could not bear to part with it. Now, quite gently, he separated the 2 girls, taking Jemima's pack away from Mercy. "Carry boy," he said to Mercy, pointing down the hill at Daniel. "Go." Mercy met the Indian's eyes. They both knew Jemima had told the truth. Jemima could not go on. And if everybody walked north and left her behind, what would happen? Jemima would be meat for predators. So when the Indian said again, "Go," Mercy skidded down the hill. but she could not miss the cracking thud of stone against bone. Please stop here and answer question 9. The tremor that had destroyed Jemima partly destroyed Uncle Nathaniel and was quivering inside her brother Sam invaded Mercy's heart. "I will be brave," she told herself. "I will stay strong. Lord, Lord, Lord," she said to him. She had never needed him more, but in this cold white wilderness she could not feel his presence. The snowball fights ended, the sledding stopped, the march went on. Nobody could help Mercy. Everybody had their own trembling legs and hearts to deal with. Horns appeared by her side. He had covered his ears and shaved head with a great scarlet muff of a hat. In his long blue coat he was astonishing, like something out of a Bible story. With mittened hands he lifted Daniel from Mercy's back, giving the little boy another bite of hard bread and setting him on his shoulder to ride high and comfortable the way Eunice Williams was riding. Then he took Mercy's hand to keep her from falling as the march went up yet another hill. Please stop here and answer question 10.